I'm Western Bragg, and this is Second Estate, a podcast where myself and guests will talk about politics, society, religion, philosophy, and culture from a counter-revolutionary, traditionalist perspective. Thanks for listening. I'm joined today by my good friend Quixote. Today we're going to be talking a bit about the future of morality. This topic was suggested by one of my followers on Instagram, and I immediately knew we had to cover it. I've been thinking about this for a while after something that happened to me last semester. I was at a philosophy club meeting we got into the subject of whether religion is a positive or negative in a society. While I argued for religion, most others in the room argued against. When I brought up the topic of morality as derived from a transcendent source rather than man, they bristled. All of them insisted that they, in fact, had strong moral codes. I doubted that, so I asked them to explain. One by one, they stated their moral codes revolved around being nice to people, and that was the end of it. I realized that day that we have a major problem with the way society thinks about morals. Moral codes, such as the club members, are extremely problematic, and that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today. So, Quixote, we're going to be talking about two philosophers in particular this episode, so could you just start off by telling us a bit about them?
Yeah. So, the two, when you told me we'd be discussing this topic, the two philosophers that came up for me that I've done work on are Alasdair MacIntyre and Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm sure a lot of listeners are very well aware of Nietzsche and his various contributions in a whole host of interesting areas, but they're probably a little less aware of MacIntyre. And MacIntyre has an interesting story. He's an ethicist. He's currently a professor at Notre Dame, and he starts out as a Marxist in Scotland in the early 20th century, and when he realized that he agreed with certain Marxist critiques, but he found that there was no moral underlying vision of how society should look, or why the current injustices of society were bad, and that's when he converts to Catholicism. And he starts to read Aquinas and a lot of Aristotle. And out of this comes this really unique synthesis where he engages with the whole history of moral philosophy from this kind of Aristotelian perspective. And he likes to show how our current moral frameworks are based very much on codes, rules, appeals to pure reason, appeals to isolated individuals, bereft of any notions of community or history. And a lot of times they deal with what he calls external goods, right? They deal with, who deserves how much money, what is the just distribution of resources. And they don't deal with internal goods like, your internal development, like honor, trustworthiness, excellence. That's a big one for him, is excellence. And so then turning to Friedrich Nietzsche, I think what's relevant in this discussion is his notion of how morality evolves and how the herd instinct, in particular, has damaged morality and brought it down and used this skeptical reason to attack this more instinctual morality that he likes, the morality of pre-Socratic Greece, if you will.
All right, so let's get started then. It occurs to me that one of the main ways this sort of thinking is problematic, the thinking of many modern moral codes, which is essentially a dumbed-down golden rule, is that it sets a simple rule to describe all morality, when in fact morality is more complex than that. Someone could hypothetically follow all the rules without ever becoming a good person. Do you agree with that?
Oh, no, yeah, that's absolutely one of the things that comes up again and again for me. And just like you were talking about the people in the club saying, like, I'm going to be a nice person. Well, Like, what if being a nice person, like, ultimately leads to the destruction, of your society or whatever? Or, like, what if being a nice person means, like, I don't really hurt other people. I let them just do, like, what they will, but I'm really not concerned with, like, their lives at all. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it's almost like if someone donates to charity, like they donate $10,000 to charity a year, just for social signaling or whatever, just because they can. It's because what everyone in their circle does. Is that person, like, really more moral than someone who, like, can't afford to do that, but donates, like, their actual valuable time, like going to like a food pantry, every weekend?
Yeah, or like a soup kitchen. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we've lost so much of what it means to be a good person because we've gone into this sort of rule-based morality. It's funny because I know a lot of Christians that have talked about the Bible in this way. Well, if you follow these rules, if you do these special things, if you get baptized and you don't sin ever, then that's all you need to do. You're good. Well, you might be good, but you might not be a good person. So you might not be good you might not be as good as you could be.
Yeah, and I mean, even with Protestantism and the emphasis on forgiveness, it's forgiveness from rules. It's like you couldn't follow the rules, but, like, you get, like, this cop-out card. Wherein more traditional Christianity, it's definitely, in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, there isn't as much, like, one point where you are, quote-unquote saved. Like, in Orthodoxy, there's this concept called theosis, which is literally like you're becoming more like God. So if your Christian life is like a journey, so to speak, you're literally becoming more and more like Christ throughout your life and through reforming yourself. And that's the emphasis, and not, just I couldn't follow the rules, I couldn't live with God's rules, but I got this forgiveness, and so so it's a very different perspective.
Yeah, that's one of the things that originally sort of turned me off towards Christianity, as I really got to thinking about it, was this sort of idea that it's like, well, so Jesus died on the cross so that I don't have to follow the rules anymore, which is one of the things that has led me towards a more I guess traditional way of thinking, more towards Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So I guess what we're kind of getting at here is more going towards, I guess, a virtue ethics point of view rather than, simply either if it's, a Kantian point of view, if it's you can never break these perfect rules, or a utilitarian point of view where it's like we need to maximize the pleasure of those around us and minimize their pain. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing about that is it doesn't offer a view of, a totalizing picture of your life, right? So one advantage of the virtue ethics system is that it allows you to conceive of your life as a totality, as a process of building toward these virtues. And this is something Nietzsche and MacIntyre both talk about. MacIntyre talks about how people's lives have become increasingly just kind of compartmentalized, and so when they're at their job, they do the right job thing, and when they're at their house, they do the right house thing. Their church, they do the right Christian thing. But there's no unity in people's life, and Nietzsche, he said that the highest expression of the will to power was the forcing of being onto a state of becoming. So Nietzsche thinks everything is becoming. He thinks everything is just like this constant chaos. But but will to power is the forcing of this, like, image of being, this image of constancy onto it, and his image of that for the person is what he calls becoming what one is, or becoming who you are, and you force this style onto your character, imbued with your values, and your life is how you become that. Pretty much, like, you say, like, this is what I'm gonna be, and this is like what I am, and then your choices throughout your life afterwards. You become that image by the repetition and rearticulation of that through your choices. Which Kantian ethics has nothing positive in it, right? It pretty much only leads to do nots.
So we know that morality can dictate a person's purpose in life, and I think with so many people feeling purposeless these days, I think it's indicative that there's a moral decline. So this idea of human purpose that can be referred to as telos, which is a Greek word meaning purpose, end, or goal. So many things can have a telos. For example, the telos of warfare is victory. But for our purposes today, we'll be talking about telos in the moral purpose of man. So what can you tell us about telos?
Yes, so this comes from ancient philosophy, and telos, so for example, like how do you tell what a good hammer is? The telos of a hammer is to hammer things, and so a good hammer hammers well. And what Aristotle wants to say is that we are like reasoning creatures, so a good human reasons well. Although he's talking about practical reason, which is very different than the pure reason of the Enlightenment philosophers. But and the purpose of this reasoning, though, is to achieve this state of eudaimonia or state of happiness that I think we'll get to later. But one of the things that MacIntyre, in his reading of Aristotle, brings out a lot is that Aristotle's community had a shared sense of telos. They knew what they wanted, and they wanted the preservation of Athens, and they wanted its flourishing and stuff. And so they were in agreement on ends. All that was in debate was really means. And he contrasts this, with modern liberalism, which almost the foundational baseline principles of liberalism is that we can't really know what the good life is. We can't really know what ends are to be pursued. So we're just going to set up a situation where everyone can pursue their own ends. This is in John Rawls, where who's probably the biggest theorist of liberalism in the 20th century, where he kind of says everyone's going to have these different ends, but we have to set up a society that isn't influenced by that at all, where everyone is able to pursue their own ends, as if he has this thing called original position, where we all get behind this veil of ignorance, where we have no memories, no knowledge of our situation, if we're going to be rich or poor, what religion we're going to be, what our conception of the good is going to be, and then we make the rules of society to keep it completely purified from any value judgments. And what this leads to is this situation where in moral arguments we don't even have the same vision of where we want to be or what's the good life, and so these moral arguments simply can't be resolved, and they simply become ways of forcing people to do things. And that's one way he sees moral language being used more and more, isn't to reason to what is beneficial to us, but to kind of just force someone's perspective through rhetoric onto them.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. You were talking about how essentially in ancient Athens they had a unified sense of purpose, and I think for more directly relating to our current civilization, we had a sense of purpose in the pre-modern era in medieval Europe. As a Christian, there's a unified purpose, and the purpose for someone's life is achieving salvation, avoiding sin, and becoming a better person by being remade through Christ. But I think since we've lost that to so much secularism, as well as liberalism, as you mentioned, which go hand in hand, we've lost that unified purpose, and so now I think that's to blame for a lot of the division that we're seeing. So do you think as we go forward, if this continues, we'll see more division?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, one thing about that, you could also throw, when you said secularism, liberalism, you could probably throw Protestantism on that as well. Because even today in Catholic countries, we see a lot more, not unity between church and state, but unity between church and community. You know what I mean? And that's one thing that Nietzsche is going to talk about in his critique of Christianity, in particular Protestantism, is that it kind of is just like fleeing to this other life, this heaven, where I think a more authentic Christianity is about, we are the new kingdom of Israel, we are the kingdom of God on earth, and so we need to bring heaven to earth, through our community and through our practices and through, loving one another and helping each other flourish. And as far as continuing division, I think one thing that you can link this concept of telos to is also the German political theorist Carl Schmitt. His conception of the political is essentially the distinction between friends and enemies. And at a certain point, which means really all politics kind of for him boils down to identity politics, but at a certain point, if you don't have the same conception of like what you want to happen at all, you're going to see new distinctions between friends and enemies emerge within a polity, within a country. And I think that's happening in America right now, is that people will view people who are ideologically similar but who come from different countries as more friends than, their ideological enemies within the same country, which is almost inconceivable, like in the ancient world. You know what
right.
I mean?
I think it's interesting. We've clearly had a spike in division recently, I think. I actually have this poll pulled up. This is a Gallup poll from last year, and it says that 77% of Americans see the country as greatly divided, which is the worst that it's been since the Vietnam War. So I think that we're seeing this really play out in the recent events of politics, with just everyone is gunning for Trump or against him, and I think it's fair to say that this wouldn't be happening if we were in a better place morally as a society.
Oh yeah, not at all, because the current politics is just, it just allows people to like blur out all their negative energy and stuff onto this kind of like scapegoat that is the other side of America, which is like incredibly unvirtuous, but it also comes from the fact that, again, like we don't have a unified community for like the truck driving, dipping, like gun-toting people in Texas. Like, people in California aren't their community. Although, to be honest, some of the other people in Texas aren't even their community, because our government never attempted to, make that a priority. All they attempted to do was create a society where people could pursue their own ends. If that means that, we have to redistribute some income, like, we'll do that. But they never attempted to, like, even consider what we would have to do to create policies that would bring Americans closer together, would create more social cohesion, social credit. That was never up for discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you. I think definitely the division is certainly tied to this sort of lack of purpose. So I wanted to talk about the fact that, today's society seems to be pretty focused on happiness, but the way that we think of happiness isn't the way that we've always thought of it. So today we're dominated by hedonic happiness, which can be explained as pleasure. If someone got high, had sex, bought a new car, or won the lottery, this is the sort of happiness that they'd be experiencing. Hedonic happiness refers to the same general idea as hedonism, but the ancients had another form of happiness, which is called eudaimonic happiness. Eudaimonia is from the Greek. It literally means good spirit or good soul. This type of happiness comes from a good character, the fulfillment of a personal goal, or contentment. It's common to say that money can't buy happiness. It certainly can, but it can generally only buy hedonic happiness and not eudaimonic happiness.
McIntyre has something where he talks about that's those internal goods, pretty much. And he thinks that there's like these kind of what he calls practices, which are, for example, like chess playing. You know what I mean? You get to a point where, like, if you're teaching like a kid to play chess, and like you give him candy when he does good, like he'll just cheat pretty much because he just wants the candy. But at a certain point, he's going to like actually want to, learn the game for the game's sake, and he's going to get a certain internal good from that. You know what I mean? Whether that be discipline, whether that could be like clear thinking. It could be a ton of things. But that's a more eudaimonic happiness, where you're, kind of seeing yourself grow, more or less. And one way I've heard it put is that when you're at a point where, like, it's not even that you necessarily have to feel happy, but that, you look at someone else, or you look at another way your life could be, and you just kind of know you wouldn't trade places with that. So, I mean, like, you know what I mean? It's like one of those things where if, like, someone's having, if your friend's girlfriend is having an affair, it's like, he would want to know that. You know what I mean? Like, it will make him less happy, but that's what he prefers. So it's almost like we can actually prefer things that don't make us less happy in that hedonic sense.
Right, and I think that's something we've certainly lost today through the evolution of morality, and you can see today that it's continuing to evolve. But how exactly did we get here today? Because, and now I disagree with Nietzsche on some things, especially in his critiques of Christianity, but I see that his argument of slave morality can apply, especially to the left. So would you care to talk about that a bit?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, so essentially Nietzsche, he has a lot of interrelated concepts here, but a big one is like the herd. And the herd is kind of this mass of people, and they suffer from this like weakness of will and stuff, because Nietzsche views will to power as essentially driving everything. And even the self is just this collection of wills. But really for him, because the herd hates distinction, the herd hates elevation, which all humans actually crave for. All humans actually crave to feel elevated, to overcome themselves. Continuous overcoming, as he calls it. But they can't achieve that, and so they need to bring the elevated down. They need to make the strong feel guilty for being strong. They need to convince the happy that they're really unhappy. And he sees this in what he calls, like, in the 19th century, romantic pessimism, where like these romantic pessimists would write about like how miserable life is, and they would make it like this universal condition, and they would try to convince people like, oh, you're actually not. Schopenhauer, the philosopher, is his perfect example of this. But like, you can never be happy. Like, happiness is impossible. Like death is like the final release and all this stuff. But he sees Christianity. Although I think part of this is because he was raised Protestant, and this is definitely a bigger part of Protestant Christianity, though it's not entirely free from Christianity. But he sees this in Christianity with elevating virtues like meekness and humbleness, as opposed to the old classical virtues of honor and courage and excellence. And I mean, I think today, we can bicker about whether that is relevant for like early Christianity, but it is certainly relevant for our modern landscape, where like a lot of leftists and stuff, these people aren't virtuous people. I'm not even talking about like approving of various behaviors, whatever, but you just know that like they're not really people of excellence, but they're coming at you with like all these moral accusations, right. And it's all essentially making you feel bad for being a virtuous person.
Right. It's interesting.
It's this inversion.
It's interesting that you say that. We actually, one of the most common uses of the word virtue today is not referring to anything in the classical sense of virtue, but as virtue signaling, which is something that the left does. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting because they clearly are not virtuous people for the most part. And I wouldn't say that the entire left in America is not virtuous, but the general majority, and especially the leadership and the spokespeople, I don't think there's any way that they can be considered virtuous people. I think it's interesting. It probably really ties into the concept that we talked about in the last episode, which is the Overton window, which is the left has to always be the little guy. They have to always be the slave on the side of the, slave-master dichotomy that Nietzsche talks about. And so they keep inventing this new sort of morality to try to, always be in this constant state of revolution or rebellion. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, well, when you talk about virtue signaling, it's like, what do they mean by that? Like, what is a virtue signal? It's always essentially just like saying the right opinion. You know what I mean? It's always just saying the right things. And I think this is like a huge difference where we can learn what not to do from the left. Is just, instead of just sitting all day, and, I love like reading all philosophy and stuff like that. But like, instead of just, and although those people probably don't, but instead of just like, figuring out the right opinions and stuff like that, and then, I'm virtuous for just like knowing all the right stuff. It's like, no, you need to change the practices in your life. You know what I mean? Like, that's how you're going to be virtuous.
Right.
It's not like, oh, I cracked the code, I figured it out, like I'm woke. It's like, no, like that's not where real virtue and real success is going to come from. It's going to come from developing your character.
Yeah, we especially see this with companies as well, which it's so clearly just a stunt. Is essentially advertising, and I think from both a classical perspective, an ancient perspective, as well as a Christian perspective, this is not virtue. Boasting about an action that you have done, specifically when you've done it for the purpose of boasting about it, is not virtuous. It's the opposite of being virtuous.
No, it's using. I mean, even if you say that action was moral or whatever, it's using it for your bottom line, or for the virtue signaling celebrity. It's using it to gain.
It's essentially all out of greed.
You know what I mean?
Because the celebrity gains money by how famous they are and how much people want to talk about them, and the company obviously gains money off of how many people are willing to buy their product. So, go ahead.
And and strangely enough, two of McIntyre's characters of modernity, as he calls them, is the rich aesthete, or we call it the celebrity, and the bureaucratic manager. And what he says is there is no conception of the good, there is no end. You know what I mean? To strive for in these people's lives. It's just essentially how good they are with the means. It's just so the celebrity is just kind of like exploiting people for pleasure, doesn't really care. The bureaucrat running this managerial operation, let's say this company that's putting out like all this like virtue signaling, stuff just to boost their bottom line and accumulate social credit, like they don't care whether what they're doing is working toward the good or anything like that. It's just like I have this particular function that was decided for me. Like, how good I am as a bureaucrat isn't how well I pursue the good. It's just merely how well I execute my function.
Right. No, I think this is a good time to get into the influence of capitalism and consumerism on our morals. Now, we can clearly see, the influence of consumerism and capitalism on some traditional values. Like, you can look at these huge companies that are so powerful that they have a social agenda, and you can see how they act. I haven't seen, these companies backing the people that would even be considered right-wing by a modern standard, even though they're the ones that want to give them tax breaks. Instead, they're always pushing progressives. You can look at this happening with Google or Facebook. It's happening constantly with conservative accounts being blocked, even conservative accounts that are not out of the mainstream whatsoever. People even doing things like quoting the Republican Party platform can get their views capped at a certain point where you won't be able to get your message out to all of your friends or all of your followers. I actually encountered this at one point where I was getting about 5% of my following base was actually seeing my posts. And I was literally only defending the Second Amendment. So it's really surprising to me that they act like this. Why do you think that they do it?
Well, one thing about the conservatives defending them is that modern conservatism is really just convincing more traditionally minded people. And actually, if you read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Virtuous Mind, Red State America or whatnot is actually closer to the more traditional moralities of the Third World and pre-industrial Europe, strangely enough. But so modern conservatism is really just getting more traditionally minded or nationalistically minded people to buy into liberalism. That's really all it is. And for the companies, why do they want a progressive, non-virtuous society? Well, I mean, that's easy because those societies ultimately are driven by hedonic happiness. And why are even progressives, they'd be fine, like, right, if we made capitalism a little fair so that the guy at the bottom could buy more stuff. And I'm reminded by this thing Nietzsche talks about, where when he's talking about the weak-willed and the strong-willed and giving style to one's character, he says essentially, like really, I'm talking about, will to power and like all this stuff, but like this takes discipline, you know what I mean? And the people who don't, like, when you create this style for yourself, or when you give your life these virtues, whatever you want to call it, you have to play within the lines, essentially, right? You have to, like, say, like, there's certain actions I can no longer do. There's certain hard decisions I have to make. And he says, like, certain people can't do that. And so they will essentially be like, no, just, like, take life as it is. You know what I mean? Just like, oh, this, it's whatever. And, like, not have any organized plan to your life. And that's kind of what consumerism is, where it's like, oh, like, we got this fad. Like, oh, isn't this great? Like, we're having a great time. Now we're going to go over here. And, like, the whole long-term goals just completely go out the window. And so there is.
I think that it's interesting because creating a more hedonic-based society means that people will not have as much sort of eudaimonic happiness, and so when they do, they'll be less fulfilled. And then the companies are able to swoop in and say, well, we know how you can be fulfilled. You have to buy our product. And then whenever that product is old, you have to buy the new product and the one after that and so on. So the companies become incredibly wealthy and they become more powerful. So once they have more money, they can start exerting more social pressure. And once they do, the cycle increases. It just repeats itself because the people become more hedonic after the companies can exert more influence over them.
Yeah, and one thing is that you can kind of tell there's been it's been kind of like why one of the things that companies will market is some kind of like identity, and it's like this is something it seems like everyone's looking for in the modern world, but instead of any kind of like organic identity, any attempts to create an actual community, like the company swoops in and they give you like this disposable identity that you can play around with for 6 months and then you can ditch it. You know what I mean? Like instead of actual communities, embedded in actual social relations and things like that involve, deep care and things like that, it just becomes like, oh, now I can buy this thing and like I'm part of this club. And then, I get bored of it in 6 months and I can switch to something else. And that's great. I mean, and that's in everything nowadays. But another thing is about in the more consumerism we have, this literally like this shortens people's time preference, and you can't have eudaimonic happiness with a short time preference. And this is a thing that Nietzsche talks about, where he talks about the ability to will over a long time, or the ability to, that essentially one way in which man is elevated is once he's able to make a promise to his future self and actually carry it out. The example being like I say, like I go on an absolute bender Friday and I eat like all this food, and then I'm like, oh God, what am I doing?
Sure.
Like I'm putting on weight, all this stuff, and I say like, okay, like Monday, I'm going to the gym. Like I make a promise to my future self. And, Nietzsche's higher man, when Monday comes around and gets off work, he actually goes to the gym, where like not everyone can. And that's one thing Nietzsche wants to bring out, is that we're torn by all these different wills and all these different drives, and we're getting pulled off track. But what we need to do is subsume them into one form, essentially. And like that's how you overcome yourself. And that for him is freedom. And that is freedom in the classical sense as well, is freedom to pursue the good, and is freedom from essentially more base desires, where now freedom is the amount of products we have at Walmart. Like, you know what I mean? Like, look how many we have compared to the Soviet Union. You know what I mean?
There's the old argument about,
like that kind of
we must be better off than everyone else because we have a microwave and we have a TV. Well, it's really interesting because if you start looking into these sort of happiness studies and things like that they do, so there's the World Happiness Report, and the main thing that goes into measuring that is actually like a country's gross domestic product, which doesn't reflect a person's happiness at all, really. Because you could be a salt miner in Turkey or something. I don't know where they have salt mines, but you could be a salt miner. You could be dirt poor, and you could go home every day and say, I'm doing this for my family, and I'm doing this because my God wants me to be a good father to my family. And you could be perfectly happy, and you could be perfectly fulfilled. And then, meanwhile, you have someone living alone in a one-room apartment, paying a ton of rent to live in Manhattan, working some sort of job that they don't enjoy, and that person is meant to be happier than the other person. Well, I don't buy it. I don't believe that that's actually true.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, school shootings are a first world problem. You know what I mean? Like, suicide is a first world problem. Like, we got all this stuff, but why does the suicide rate keep going up? Why is everyone ODing all of a sudden? You know what I mean? It's not, you can't just say that standard of living is happiness. You can't say that, well, we're the best, it's the best it's ever been. Like, you can see that argument trotted out so many times, and just looking around you, it's not true, because looking around you see so many people that are miserable, and it's because like they don't have any vision for what their life could be or what it's going to be. It's just like this kind of vague, like I'm doing this, I'm going to law school or going to med school.
Sure, they have no moral purpose.
Like, it's just, you know what I'm saying? Like we're like Heidegger, another philosopher. His definition of human is the being that essentially interprets itself, the being for whom its own existence is an issue. So we take issue with our existence, and in more traditional societies, you have a place and you understand what your place is in this wider,
and that's something we've lost.
You know what I mean? Like exactly, because like the definition of the polis, and why it's not really accurate to translate it as like city or state or whatever, is because like Aristotle defines the polis as essentially all the members of it. It's not like an institution above it. It's like you are physically a part of it, and you're part of this social web. Whereas now you're just kind of told like, oh, you're a human being. You know what I mean? And, like, you just kind of gotta figure out what you want to do. And so no one has any idea really what they want to do. And so they just end up, like, wandering through their lives, consuming stuff, but that just leads to endless desires. And yeah, so that argument is ridiculous.
So, to get back to the club members from the beginning of the episode, one of the major problems with their way of thinking is that they plagiarize the golden rule from the Bible, but in doing so, they take it out of context. Christ says not only love your neighbor as yourself, but also you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and all your strength. Without this love of God, one loses connection to the transcendent and is only liable to their fellow man. The problem with humanity in this case is that we change. I guarantee that everyone in that room would have said that cannibalism, for example, is immoral, but there's nothing in their moral code to say so. If one loves his neighbor as himself, then that's all well and good, but what is to stop him from doing meth? Nothing. In fact, the so-called golden rule is not the greatest commandment. Loving God is. Without this anchor to a solid, transcendent moral code, we're subject to moral drift. This is similar to the topic of the Overton window, which, again, you're familiar with that if you listened to the last episode. Just as many of our actions would be unimaginable to our ancestors, without a moral anchor, our descendants may stray into territory that we consider abhorrent.
I think the biggest thing is returning to a shared moral anchor. Whether you want to say you need absolute, rock solid, transcendental basis, whether you think you just need like a shared general orientation, even over time, maybe one that is universal. I think the most important thing is that we need to have a shared conception of morality and conception of the good, and one that is based off of excellence and flourishing, and not merely on not being mean or something like that. And one thing that I think puts us in context is the way this current morality doesn't put emphasis on the instinctual elements of morality. Like a French writer, Ernst Renan, talked about, that the mother doesn't need an ethical theory to, love her child, and the soldier doesn't need an ethical theory to sacrifice himself. But also, I think when we're talking about moral development and, whether it's a good thing or it's a bad thing, the way you can tell part of that is by looking at your community in the context of its historical traditions and seeing how are things different back then, how are things different now. Because the way so essentially what liberalism's done is it's taken this, like, if you think of all communities, civilizations as these organically developing entities, liberalism has taken one stage of our particular civilization and has essentially said, this stage is the last stage. This stage was like all there was really ever going to be. This stage is valid for the whole world. And it said this is it. And that if there's any development from here, it's simply getting rid of the bad aspects that have kind of creeped over from the older stages. Where really, you need to be looking at the past as, that was us. And what can we learn from it? What should we not do? But also, what could we do? And that's how you evaluate is, is our moral system pushing us toward the good? How do you know? Is you have to look at where you've come from. And I think when you look at where you come from, when you see the way that, strangers were treated in anxious societies and the virtue of hospitality compared to the, nowadays, neighbors don't care about each other, don't know each other's names, or the way the emphasis placed on taking care of, your parents when they became old and things like that. In anxious societies where now you just send them off to a home and die, you say, oh, wait, like, we have lost something. Like, there's an element of care here that's been lost. And I think part of it is tied up in this notion of rights, because it was really in contrast with obligations, which are come out of my virtue and my character, and saying, I am an upstanding individual, and so I have an obligation to do this for this person. What rights do is they say, essentially, either don't mess with me, it's completely antisocial, or it kind of almost elevates you above the community. And it says, just by virtue of being, I am entitled to these resources, like my Medicaid, instead of saying I'm going to take care of, my elderly parent because I am a good person. I am, this is my duty to do this for this individual. Now it's like, oh, the old person says I have a right to my Medicare. It just means I'm entitled to all your resources, which is like this completely different mindset that just turns, it's very Heideggerian in a sense, when he talks about how we view nature as just resources and how eventually we will come to view humanity as just resources. I think that's the same way with rights and this with our current moralities. We just view that we've just come to view people as resources.
All right, so ultimately, what do you think the verdict is for the future of morality? Do you think that we have a chance here, or do you think that we're doomed to continue to decline?
Essentially, what's been going on for quite a while now is that we have this way that works, this way that's fine, or we want to say, don't do this, you should do this, and it's just understood that this is beneficial. And then someone starts asking why, and no one could, figure out like why this system is like absolutely true. You know what I mean? And essentially, we say, oh, it doesn't hurt anyone, so we say, okay, we'll allow it. You know what I mean? And this has happened with everything. And I think that what's going to happen is that our morality is going to keep getting more degraded faster and faster, and that's what we're seeing with these. With the transgender kid stuff and all that. But I think that it's getting so bad that there might be a reaction against that. But most importantly, I think it's up to us to be the change, so to speak, because it's when we articulate the strength of the modern view set, of the modern viewpoint, is that it's reinforcing to you every day, and you see it every day, and so it becomes real. It becomes the way things are. Exactly.
Well, you were talking about what we should do.
So how does our morality become real? We enact it in the world. You know what I mean? We discover it. We, undertake the journey. And by doing that, it becomes real. And, people see you, and you're like, oh, well, what's that group doing? That's wild. No one else does that. What's that system like becomes real in a sense, and that's the biggest way of shaking people out of the modern, viewpoint in my image. And that's and right. It's very Christian,
no, I agree with you.
In the sense that when Jesus is on the earth and he's speaking about the kingdom of heaven is drawing near, and you're the kingdom on earth and stuff. And when he's essentially enacting it by expelling these sickness and these evil forces and saying and elevating this community, they are making heaven real on earth through their practice. And that's what we need to do essentially, is to make the society we want to see real through our practice. Because if we just sit around and talk about theory all day and say how miserable everything is, nothing will change. It's up to us to create.
Yeah. So I think you're saying something that I agree with, which is that it could go either way. I think, but it's ultimately going to be up to us to decide which way it goes, because I think that the current system has created so much division, as it has progressed, that we are so far apart on these different sides in the world now, that whenever they enact more and more progress, it doesn't make us all move together. It makes us move further apart. So I think that's probably the saving grace here. So I think ultimately what we will have to do if we want to be successful is that we have to create a counter society. We have to create a counter moral code to their moral code, which I think people are increasingly realizing is insane. So I think that's basically our message here, is that this is up to us to create this new system, or reinvigorate an old system that people can turn to as they turn away from the modern system.
One more thing on that. That is true, that the biggest difference is that we're not moving unanimously anymore. That there is a kind of separation, but like Red America is not going to save us. Their system is their system's broken as well, and they've to a large extent lost the way as well. So again, it's really up to us.
No, yeah, for sure. So I think that about wraps up our episode. So thank you for coming on, Quixote. I look forward to having you on again.
Enjoyed it.
So I hope you liked this episode. It was kind of me trying out a new format, sort of an interview style. So if you liked it, make sure you let me know. And if you didn't like it, then tell me that as well. In the future, let me know if you want to see more guests on, or if you like the format of the previous episode, which was just sort of me talking about a subject. Also, let me know about the length of the episode. If you think this episode was too long, or if you think the previous episode was too short, then let me know that as well. If you like this podcast, then the best way to support it is to let your friends know, and also rate and review on Apple Podcasts. That's the best place for us, because it really lets us get the word out there, and that's the most common podcast platform. So, as always, this has been Second Estate, and thank you so much for listening.